Hello everyone, BritSimon here. Good evening to you, and I'm sorry that you've had to wait for a few days for this, but this video is going to be talking about Africa and predictions for where a final cutoff could be now that we know more about the CEAC data. So I've had a few days to have a look at the data, and I've already produced videos for Europe, Asia, and Oceania. I may do one for South America. I'm not quite sure whether I'll do one for South America or not. But Africa, I'm saving the best till last, in a sense, right? If you're African, I hope you appreciate that keeping you in suspense. Okay, so there's quite a bit to talk about with Africa, and I feel like we almost need to, before we talk about the data for DV25, we need to talk about what has been happening in recent years and the way that the government has tried to encourage Africa to meet its quota. So let me introduce the concepts of quota, and we can talk about that. And I'll show you some data as well. Okay, so let me bring this over here, show you some data. So firstly, let's talk about quota. The quotas are a mathematical or formulaic calculation of how many visas should be given to each region. The formula relies on a couple of things, mainly the population. Well, it's a combination of the population of the countries within the region and also the existing movement under three main visa categories, not DV lottery, over recent years, right? And so there's a formula that says, is this country in a lower emission? Is it a lower emission country? Is it a lower emission state or region, I should say? And then once we know which are the lower emission regions and which are the higher emission regions, there's a formula based on population. And so the formula, although it comes up with a number, which I'll show you in a moment, it comes up with a number. And although it's not a strict number, the government have shown signs in the past, in the last 20 years that I've been looking at data. I've looked at about 20 years worth of data. And I've been, excuse me, I've been talking about DV lottery for 11 years. So during the time I've been sort of actively involved, I have seen years where the quotas have been met almost to the exact number. And I've seen other years where the quotas have been wildly ignored or appeared to be wildly ignored. So let me show you the quotas for DV25. Our good friend Zarthisius has calculated these for us. I'm very grateful that he's done that. He's got a way of plugging in all the numbers and it pops out these calculations, so it's fantastic. The quotas are based on a percentage, or they come down to a percentage of the quota. So if the quota was 55,000, then this column would represent the quotas for each of the regions. Okay. However, as you probably know, and as you should know, there has been a reduction in the number of visas available in DV25 down to 52,000, right? And so there is a subsequent reduction in Africa's case, for example, 1,362 visas less will be given to Africa because of the reduction to 52,000 from 55,000. So it's the same percentage splits between the regions, but there are less visas for Africa in particular and some of the other regions. So now we have a quota, a target, if you like, of 23,610. Okay. Now, if we look at performance over the last few years, let's look at this one. If we look at what happened in DV24, Africa received through consular processing 22,500 visas. That represents a shortfall against the quota it should have done, right? In DV23, if we have a look at 23, there was just under 21,000 through consular processing. Again, that represents a shortfall. It's a miss. Now, in both of those years, you can actually see that the government made the regions current, like in DV 2023, they made Africa current. And then in 24, they did the same thing again. They made the region current. So there were almost no interviews processed in DV 2024, of course, in the higher number ranges. But KCC, for their part, did at least say that anybody could get an interview. What year am I looking at here? Yeah, it's 24. I'm looking at the wrong region there. This is Africa. 122,000 was the top number, and there were cases scheduled right up to that top number, but very few in the higher number ranges, right? And so this was an example where in DV 2023 and 24, the government decided at the last minute that they were running short of the quota for Africa, and therefore decided to make the region current to see who else we could give a visa to. It was almost a sort of it was a big shock in DV24, not quite such a big shock in DV23, but the math didn't justify this push in terms of where they should have cut off. What they should have done is they should have scheduled more cases in the lower number ranges. But for various reasons, there were embassies that were underperforming, and therefore the government found it necessary to push the region current to try and get them to the quota, but it still didn't even get them to the quota in DV24 or 23. Okay, so what has that told the government in terms of the feedback loop? What that's told them in a sort of kind of clumsy way is that they needed to increase the number of selectees in Africa, which is what they've done, because they think the problem is, well, we're making the region current at the last minute, and they didn't issue all of the visas. Therefore, there must be lots of people in Africa that don't want these visas. That's not really the case. The reality was they made things happen so late in the process that there wasn't enough time to schedule all of these people, nor was there enough capacity at the embassies. And there were some embassies misbehaving anyway, right? So if we look, though, we go back to our spreadsheet, and I'll show you some other information in this. If we look at the number of selectees over the last few years, I've tracked here DV 23, 24, and 25 selectees for Africa. And you can see that in DV 23, they selected just over 49,000. They didn't get enough visas, so they selected more in Africa in DV 24, right? They made the region current, and they still didn't get, even though they had increased by nearly 6,000 selectees, they still didn't get enough people through to meet the quota. And that quota, by the way, was then eaten or taken by the other regions. That unused quota was taken by other regions, which they were very grateful for. But what the government would rather do is have Africa meet its quota and have all of the regions sort of properly balanced in terms of their quotas. And so in DV25, they've increased by 1.66%. Not a lot, only about less than 1,000 people increase. But if you look at the other regions have all had a decrease, okay, ranging from 17% decrease in selectees in Asia, 13% in EU, and then nearly 9% in OC, and nearly 13% in South America. So the other regions were decreased, partly to allow for the fact that they still didn't go current at the end. It was not necessary to have quite so many selectees. That was one case. And also, we're going to have less visas in DV25, right? So even though 1.66% is not a big percentage increase, you have to take it more seriously when you look at the other regions having been decreased, okay? So it's an increase of Africa while every other region is substantially decreased in terms of the number of selectees. So the story, or the perspective you need to sort of understand here, is that the government have been trying and failing to get Africa to meet its quota. And to an extent, I think it's that they don't understand what's really happening, right? What was really happening was that they were having embassies that were misbehaving, were backlogged, etc. And by the time they sort of ramped up the numbers, the embassies were unable to respond with the sort of speed they needed. So when you have powerhouse embassies like Cairo, like Addis Ababa, like Accra, like who else? Perhaps was running bad, but well, those mainly. When you have those sort of embassies behaving badly or not behaving to their full potential, it affects a lot of people. Cairo, for example, in DV2025 has 5,500 Egyptian selectees, plus it is the home embassy for the Sudanese applicants, another 5,500 people. So there's over 11,000 people that are, their home embassy is Cairo. So if Cairo were to misbehave and go slow, it affects a huge chunk, 11,000 out of 55,000 people, right? So it is incredibly important that those big embassies actually work correctly. Now, we already know that Accra is not going to work correctly in DV25, right? It's just not. We've got to just face reality, and anybody assigned to Accra, unless you've got an extremely low number, less than 3,000 or 4,000, maybe 5,000, unless you've got an extremely low number, you need to get the hell out of Accra immediately. You need to get yourself reassigned to some other embassy. If you don't do that, you will lose your green card. It is as simple and as clear as that. Okay. So that I've been shouting from the rooftops for months now, in fact, for a couple of years. So, hopefully people have heard that warning and have moved their cases elsewhere. We have Addis, which has been performing badly for the last couple of years, that has started off very strongly in DV25. We also see a strong performance from other important embassies such as Cairo. And Nairobi, although it's been a strong performer for a couple of years, has started off a little bit slowly, but I have pretty high confidence that it will return to high performance over the next couple of months. So I hope to see that. But I'm more or less assuming that Nairobi will be another powerhouse as well. Okay. So if we start looking at, let's start looking at some important data here. We start looking at some of the countries which will be important this year, right? I mean, all the countries are important. I don't mean to say that some small country in Africa is unimportant. I'm not saying that. But if you look at this list of countries here, Algeria, Egypt, Sudan, Morocco, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Cameroon. If you look at just those countries, which is 7 countries, and you total up the number of issued visas for those countries in DV 2024, it totals up to 16,427, which is about just under 75% of all the visas issued in Africa. So of all the visas issued in Africa, which was 22,500, 16,500 went to just these 7 countries. And so if you look at these 7 countries and we start to look at those as being important to the overall process, because 75% of all the visas will probably be issued to those countries, then we need to look at whether those countries are going to perform better in DV25 or not, right? So let's have a look at each of those countries, and let me explain some of those countries. We know that there will be an accept for 3 of these countries. These are Algeria, Egypt, and Morocco, right? An accept notation in the visa bulletin is a way of slowing down processing at that one embassy, because that one embassy tends to be saturated by all of the applicants from that area. And we see that also, for example, in Nepal. We see Kathmandu embassy being slowed down in the same way, because they have a lot of applicants and all of them, or almost all of them, go to that one embassy, right? So it's not necessarily just the number that is the issue here, but it's the number of selectees that go through that one embassy in a short period of time because of the condensation of the case numbers in lower number ranges. I've explained that in other videos. I'm hoping you understand why some countries have all of their winners concentrated in lower number ranges, but we do have that going on in this year as well. And so we will expect to see the accept continue for those 3 countries right to the end of the year. Okay, so now if we then look at the number of people selected, this is winners plus derivatives, right? And in DV25, there are these 3 countries, Algeria, Egypt, and Sudan, that have a huge number of selectees, 5,500 selectees each. And all 3 of those were capped countries or limited countries, where their maximum case number will be lower than the ultimate case number. The ultimate case number is 86,700. Algeria, Egypt, Sudan will definitely have no more case numbers after some point. If we have a look at the DV25 data here, if we have a look at that for Africa, you can see that density decreases after about 34,000. It looks to me like there are 2 countries that are limited after that point, between 34,000 and about 40,000. And so there are a couple of countries which are limited at that point. And what that means is, let's say, for example, let's take Algeria. I don't know that this is the case. I don't know which countries represent these drops, but let's say it was Algeria, that there were no cases above 34,000 for Algeria, right? That means that as soon as that limit is hit, because they already had their 5,500 selectees, then there are no more cases, and that means that there are more holes after that point, right? And so you can see there is a drop in density due to these country limited countries. And we see that the density of real cases decrease against the number of holes per 1,000, right? And so you can see that has happened at several points. I explained that actually on the Asia process, the Asia video that I did yesterday. I explained that in a very clear way for Nepal and Iran, because it's a very simple region. I can calculate the numbers for that pretty easily. And I've put a little chart out there, which actually I'll show you now. Wouldn't harm to show you that right now, but I can demonstrate to you. Let's see, AS projection. No, what would it be? AS distribution. Yeah. So this is the calculation. By looking at the data and understanding the data, I'm able to see how many cases per 1,000 for Nepal there are, and I was able to determine that Nepal has no cases after 11,500. And so there is a block of cases there which are Nepalese cases. When that stops, when those cases stop, there's a drop in density. The same thing happens for Iran. Iran is limited after 14,500. So there's a drop in density. And the rest of Asia, which is all the other countries combined, continue until 30,000. There's a block of a consistent set of numbers, all the way to 30,000. If you look at the actual real data for the same data I was just explaining there, this is the actual layout, and you can see there's the cutoff, there's the cutoff for Nepal, there's the cutoff for Iran, and that's the rest of Asia continuing at that pace. So you can see there's actually 3 blocks, as I've made it clear in the Asia picture. There are 3 blocks of cases, and roughly speaking, Iran gets 20% of the cases. In every 1,000 cases, they get 20%. Nepal get 20%. The rest of Asia get 20%. And at the beginning, at least, there were 40% of the cases which are holes. Okay, so so that hopefully that sort of makes things a little clearer about why we have that drop in density when countries are limited. Okay, so if we go back to our Africa prediction here, so there are some countries which are limited. There are other countries which may be limited. They have lower number of selectees, but if those countries have a low derivative rate, and a couple of those countries certainly do, then they may have had enough cases to be limited, even though the number of selectees is lower. Okay, and that's partly because when those people are found to be winners, often those people will find themselves getting married and perhaps having babies, and those derivative numbers will swell fairly quickly. It happens every year, and mainly in those countries. Okay, so that's in terms of the selected. Now, if we look at, I want to look at DV. Sorry, let me just put in here DV24 selectees. Okay, so if we look at how many visas were issued to each of these countries last year, we can see 2721 were issued to Algeria from 5,142 selectees, right? 2722 from 5,500. 1953, Sudan only got 1953 from 5,400 selectees that were originally chosen, right? And as we look at Morocco, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Cameroon, you can see varying numbers here, but very strikingly, you can see, for example, Ethiopia only got 1,561 cases or issued visas, even though they had 3,034 people selected. And so what happened there was they were heavily restricted by Addis Ababa misbehaving. Now, that's the DV24 selectees. I'm proposing that we will see increases in each of these countries in terms of the number of visas issued to these countries in DV25. Why am I saying that? Well, it varies a little bit per country. So in Algeria, they got 2721 last year from 5,100. They've had a 400 increase in the number of selectees. I think it's reasonable, and I think that they will perform well. I think it's reasonable to assume that they will have an increase in visas issued of 200, because they're getting 400 more selectees, and their embassy is doing pretty well, right? Will behave well. Egypt has about the same number of selectees, but Cairo is already performing better than it performed last year, and therefore I would say that more Egyptians will get their visas, and I think we could see even up to a 500 increase over their DV 2024 numbers, right? Sudan had a tough time last year, partly because Cairo was not performing, but also it's more difficult for Sudanese applicants to prove their documents are real and that sort of thing. And so, there's more risk, but they've got slightly more selectees, and they're at a better, the embassy that they're at is performing better. And so again, I think we could see a 500 increase for Sudan. We'd see something like 2,450 visas issued from the 5,500 in DV25, right? Compared to the 1953 that we had last year, okay? Follow me along with this as well for the next few countries. In Morocco has an equivalent number of selectees to last year, but I think they would see slightly better performance, and we could see a slightly increased number of selectees. I think they can do better. Morocco has had a bit of a sort of an odd couple of years. They were doing better a couple of years ago than they did last year as an embassy, but I think they'll return to form. So I think there could be a 300 increase in that country. In Kenya, Kenya embassy performed very well last year, no doubt about it. From 3,760, they were able to issue 2,809, and Nairobi also did a lot of visas for a lot of other countries, and they did exceptionally well. No doubt about it that they performed well. But there is an increase of, 200, 600 and something, 601 more selectees for Kenya this year, right? And I think it's reasonable to assume, therefore, that we'll see another 300 people going through and being issued in Kenya this year compared to last year, right? I don't think that's unreasonable. Ethiopia. Ethiopia has got an increase of 240 selectees over last year, and Addis is performing much better out of the gate, right? Addis appears to have fixed its performance problems that we experienced last year. And I think Addis is going to perform much better. In that situation, and bearing in mind that the 3,600 people here, actually we've got a 600 increase, not a couple of hundred, but yeah, we've got a 600 increase in number of selectees, a better performing embassy than we saw last year. And those 3,600 people will be marrying and having babies as well. So I think it's entirely possible that instead of seeing just 1,561 visas issued to Ethiopians this year, that we could see 1,000 more than that, 2,500 visas issued, right? That would be the biggest single change for any of these large countries I'm looking at, these top 7 countries. And then Cameroon. Cameroon have had a 500-person increase. They performed pretty well last year, but they've had a 500-person increase. And so I think we'll see a couple of hundred more visas issued for Cameroon. Okay. Now, if you total those numbers up, and I would hope that you would see my logic. The logic is slightly different for each country. It's either based on having more selectees or a better performing embassy, or a combination of both those factors. But if we total those up, that's 3,000 extra issuances that we would see within those 3 countries. So instead of getting 16,500, we would see, 16,500 last year. We would see 19,500 if my assumptions are all correct. Now, maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe I get that a little bit wrong. Maybe it's only 18,500 from those 7 countries. But it clearly is going to be a different ball game if the countries, the 7 countries that produced 73% of the issuances last year, now have an increase in performance that allows them to issue up to 19,500. Remember, we're only looking for the whole region 23,600, right? So those 7 countries alone will take up to about 19,500, and then we'll only have 4,000 left for all the other countries combined, right? So these 7 countries are really the key to the game this year, all right? And instead of talking about the way last year operated, we need to realize that if these embassies perform better, as I suspect they will, even despite Accra's misbehavior, the region as a whole will perform much differently. And whilst last year the government felt like they needed to push the region current, and they did the same thing in DV2023, and whilst they've been increasing the numbers both in DV2024 and DV25, they've been increasing the selectee numbers. We will now see the region performing better by itself anyway, and that number of selectees we've got, nearly 56,000 selectees, is going to be massively too many for this particular region to handle for the quota that it's got of 23,600. Okay? So hold that information in your head if you could for a moment, and let me know if you think I'm wrong about those assumptions on those 7 countries. Let's talk about the number of cases that we need to have scheduled in Africa in order to issue those 23,600 visas we need to issue to meet the quota, right? And this is about meeting the quota. It's not necessarily about exceeding the quota, but it's about meeting the quota, right? So in DV23, there were 15,500 scheduled. They didn't meet the quota. They issued 21,000. So that's not enough cases being scheduled. In DV24, they scheduled 16,500 and they issued about 22,500. So that's not enough, right? So we actually need to see about 17,500 cases scheduled in Africa in order for them to get to their quota. Now, That's a lot of cases. If I just go back and show you some data here, if we look at DV24, you can see that in DV24, that's that number of cases scheduled, right? That's 31,600 people, but out of that, only 22,500 were actually issued. The other nearly 10,000 or 9,000, the other 9,000 were either refused or they didn't turn up for their interview, or they remained in 221G right up to the last minute, right? Now, look at the number of cases that they have to schedule in Africa compared to the number of cases they had to schedule in, let's look at Europe, 8,794. So there are it's almost a 2-for-1 ratio. For every case in Europe, to get to 18,000, to get to a little bit more, just 4,000 more, they had to double the number of cases that they scheduled. The reason for that is the derivative rate. The derivative rate varies greatly between Africa and Europe, and so it's just a very commonly understood thing that you've got to schedule more cases in Africa than you would in any other region. There's no other region that needs that number of cases scheduled. Okay, so now that's DV24. Have a look at where we stand in DV25 already. Let's just have a quick look here. They've already scheduled 5,200 cases. And as I say, I think we need to see them schedule about 17,500 cases. So we will see, I believe, around about 12,300 cases scheduled in the next 7 months. Can they do that? Is there capacity for that? Absolutely, more than enough capacity to do that. So if they behave correctly, if the government behave correctly and keep moving the visa bulletin reasonably and keep the embassies busy, then we could see very fast performance and very fast issuance of visas. I'm not suggesting the process will end early, but we could get to a situation where in August we're pretty close to the cap and they don't feel the need to push the region current as they have the last couple of years. And I think of all the years that we've been looking at in recent years, this is probably the year where we return to the situation where Africa does not go current. And that's going to be upsetting to a lot of people who are used to seeing Africa going current. I didn't think Africa would go current last year, but even though it went current, it was more or less a false victory, because if you look at the data, you can see that almost no one above, let's say about 85,000, 80,000 case number, the top 40,000 case numbers, your chance of being scheduled for interview was very, very low, even though you were current. There just wasn't enough capacity in the embassies for this sudden last-minute push that they gave. And so we're not going to see that this year. We won't see that same phenomenon this year. We probably won't see Africa being made current. And we will probably see, by August, we'll probably get to something like 19 or 20,000 visas issued fairly comfortably, pretty easily. Because all they've got to do is perform well in March, April, May, the traditionally fairly busy months, busier than the first 3 months of the year. And they would be able to get to 20,000 visas issued quite easily with the number of embassies that are now performing better. Don't forget, we've got Addis working better, we've got Cairo working better, we've got other embassies working very well. So it's more than likely that we'll get to about 20,000 visas issued by the end of August, I would say. And then that means that September doesn't need to be a chaotic month. In fact, we could even see more like 21,000 by the end of August, I think, fairly comfortably. We'll have to see how that goes, right? I'll be revisiting that statement and that assumption over the course of this year. Okay, so if they're not going to go current in the region, what is going to happen? Well, let's just sort of talk about that, right? So I've mentioned that we need to see 17,500 cases being scheduled. In order to get scheduled, you need to have submitted your DS260, and some people don't do that. Those people I call a non-response. And around about 10 to 15% of cases easily in Africa won't respond, right? We'll have a non-response rate, which means that, let's say, to get that many, you would need something like, call it 21,000 at least, right? Just for the non-response. You'd need to have 21,000 cases to allow for 15% of those cases to not respond. That would be about 3,000 cases, and that would reduce you down to 18, which is going to give us the 17,500, right? That's the minimum, okay? Now, there will be some other people who will be blocked for various reasons. There may be some embassy backlogs, there may be some capacity issues, there may be some people who can't travel. So those cases, just even though the people submitted a DS260, they will turn to ready, and those people may not even turn up for their interviews, right? But those are taken account of in the 17,500. We already know that, for example, in DV24, about 4,000 people remained at ready status, right? So it's really the non-responses that we, would sort of take out of there. And the non-response number in DV24 would have looked higher because of all the people blocked by underperforming embassies, people at Addis, people at Cairo, and that sort of thing, right? So if we make the assumption that Cairo and Addis and other embassies are going to perform better, with the exception of Accra, and that Nairobi performs better, then to get 17,500 people scheduled probably doesn't need much more than about 21 to 23,000. So that means the danger range starts at around about 50,000, roughly. Now, I think that's a bit low, in all honesty, but if we look at the number of cases below each of these numbers, below 50,000, there are nearly 24,000 cases. Could we get 17,500 cases from 24? It's a possibility, right? Below 60,000, there are 27,250. Could we get 17,500 from 27,000? Yeah, we really could. It'd be quite easy to get that, to have 10,000 cases essentially just for whatever reason not scheduled. That would be quite easy, right? And looking at the higher end, 70,000, below 70,000, there are 30,000 cases, right? So this is a running total. The 23,711 is included in the 27,259. You understand that, right? This is the number of cases below this number. But what that's telling me is that we're certainly not going to get to 86,709, where there are 34,000 cases. We're not going to get to that, right? In my opinion, we won't go current this year in Africa. In my opinion, we probably won't get to 70,000 either. And I think the cutoff is probably going to be around about the 60,000 number, give or take a couple of thousand, maybe 58,000, maybe 62,000, around about that range, right? And the minimum safe number, I think, is going to be 50,000. I'm hoping you can see this. Maybe I should make this screen a little bit bigger for you, actually, so you can see these numbers. Hopefully you can see that. So the minimum safe number, I believe, is about 50,000. And my expected range, for one thing or another, things always go a little bit wrong somewhere. And so my expected range is between 55 and 65,000, with the sweet spot I'm hoping to see something like 58,000, 60,000, 62,000. I'm hoping to see that number. But even that, some people will tell me I'm being too optimistic, and that they would say there's going to be a lower cutoff than that. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're right. I'm just a bit more of an optimistic person. I would rather look at the optimistic side to an extent. I also do want to warn you of the realities and the dangers and give you the bad news. I would rather give you the bad news in a sense than telling you a bunch of useless stories that, telling you if your case number is 85,000, there really is no point in me telling you that you're going to be fine, right? And if somebody says that, and if they say things like just believe in God, God will always make miracles happen. I'm sorry, but this is simple math. This has nothing to do with miracles. Okay. So that's up to you to decide whether you would rather believe in pure blind faith or whether you believe in math, and whether you understand and accept the explanations I've given, particularly about those 7 countries, right? Now, there is a big sort of unknown factor in this whole thing, right, which is Trump. The Trump administration will take office on January the 20th. Donald Trump is not currently the president of the USA, but he will become the president on January the 20th. And almost immediately, he's going to implement certain policies. He's going to try and make changes. He'll try and have the Republican Party introduce and pass laws to do various things. One of the things that he will probably do is probably directed against controlling or reducing immigration in some way. He could do things such as making processing harder, particularly for countries where there are terrorism concerns and that sort of thing. He could make it harder. He could implement bans. He can implement something like the travel bans that we have seen before, right? There's various things he can do. But if you look at what he did before, he was, when he was president before, he was most concerned about Muslim majority countries. And when the bans came out, for Africa, there was, I think, 3 countries affected. There was Chad, which was put on the ban list and taken off. There was Sudan, and there was Egypt, right? And so I've marked Sudan and Egypt as possible countries that could get affected if Trump were to re-implement a ban. And if he did that, then that would make case numbers, higher case numbers for other countries happy, because they would then have more chance, right? But do I think he's going to do that? I don't think so. I don't think he's got the same motivation or justifications that he felt he had back in 2017 when he implemented the Muslim ban. And although he went on to implement 3 versions of the Muslim ban and then also a COVID ban, and he flexed his muscles in terms of shutting down immigration in quite powerful ways. Although he did all those things, I don't think he has quite the same drivers to do those things at this point in time. I could be wrong. Things could change, right? But I don't think, I wouldn't expect Egypt and Sudan to be affected by Trump policies in the same way they were in 2017, right? I also don't think there are any other countries in Africa that have a realistic chance of being impacted by Trump policies. I mean, yes, there are some countries that could be on a list, but I don't think it's really going to happen. Maybe Somalia, perhaps Sudan, but I don't think there's going to be much appetite for that. Most of Trump's interest at the moment in terms of immigration is in locking down the border at the southern border, and I think that will be probably the main drive of his actions to start with. Okay, so for that reason, I'm going to publish these estimates with my range of 55 to 65 and a minimum safe of around about 50,000. So if your case number is below 50,000, unless you're in a accept country, then you really don't need to be asking me, am I safe? If you're 40,000, you're in Cameroon or something, don't ask me, am I safe? It's kind of a waste of my time and yours to ask me those questions purely because you want me to tell you that you'll be okay and, tuck you in and read you a story. You're all adults. I'm giving you the information here. I don't need to answer each individual question from everybody who just wants to be reassured about their particular case number, right? So please use some common sense. If you're not in one of those limited countries and you are below 50,000, then you really don't need to be asking me. If you're in one of these accept countries, I don't know, unfortunately, where the cutoffs are for those countries. If I could try and get more information from you guys, we could try and find out where the cutoffs are for these countries. Like, what is the highest Egyptian case number? Some of you may already know that. My friend in Egypt, who's a YouTuber, may be able to help me with some of that information. Well, he's not in Egypt actually. He's in America, but he talks to Egyptians. Same for Algeria, same for Morocco. I would like feedback about what your highest case numbers are in those countries, right? And then we can start to talk about the percentages of these countries, these 5,500 selectees in those countries that could get lucky. Remember, there is a 7% cap on any country. It's not a quota, it's a cap. And there's a difference in those two things. It does not mean that every country will get 7% of the number of visas available. What it means is that no one country can go above that number. Now, there's almost no countries that can get approvals fast enough or reliably enough to get that way. Egypt, funnily enough, was one of those countries that traditionally could impact the 7% number and usually was slowed down to avoid going over that 7% number. That's because Egyptians had a very high response rate, a very high approval rate, and subsequently they were able to get to the sort of 35 to 3,800 issued visas range, which was the 7% cap. This year, the cap is going to be at about 3,600. And so there are some countries here that could, if they had a high enough approval rate and a high enough response rate, they could get there. And so we do need to think about that for countries like Egypt in particular. Not so much for Sudan, not so much for the other countries, but Egypt, I think, is probably the most likely example of that, right? And you'll see if you look at the math here, adding 500 to 2722 there, that takes us to 3,200. It's pretty close to the cap, right? So if my assumption is right, then they are going to get fairly close to the cap. Whereas I'm only adding 200 to Algeria's number there. I'm adding 500 to Sudan, but their number is lower. And there's no other country here where I'm taking it sort of reasonably close, maybe Kenya. But again, I don't see Kenyans getting enough issuances to threaten the cap, right? I don't think that's going to be an issue. What do you think of these estimations? Have you understood what I've explained here? I hope I've given you the right information for you to understand what I'm trying to convey here in terms of what will happen. I'd be interested to hear from you to see whether you think I'm right or wrong. But actually, it doesn't matter whether I'm right or wrong in one sense. I'm not in control of this. Neither are you, right? We are not in control of this thing. So even if I've said something that you don't like, there is no reason to attack me for my opinion, right? You can, by all means, state your opinion and point out where you think it's differently. But if you've turned to anger because I've said something you don't like, or I've disappointed you because your case number is 85,000 or something, I apologize for the disappointment, but I would rather be straight with you. I would rather be honest with you than blowing wind up your ass, telling you everything is going to be wonderful if only you pray enough. I don't believe in those things, and I don't think it will work out that way, because I believe in math, I believe in statistics, I believe in science, I believe in those things. And you can believe in whatever you want. But as I say, there's no need to get angry with me if you don't agree with me about these things. Okay. Let's just round this off. So those are the numbers. Those are my estimations and predictions. People will ask me, by the way, to predict visa bulletin progress between now and the end of the year. I generally won't want to do that, but it's fairly obvious, right, that if we've got 7 months left and we're currently at 22,000, and I think we're going to get it to about 55,000, then we have about 30,000 visa bulletin numbers to move in 7 months. They don't need massive jumps, right? So I don't think we're going to see 10,000 and 15,000 case number jumps in any given month. They don't need to do that, right? They need to do something like, how many do they need? 17. They need 17,000. Got 5,000. Got 12. So we need about 12,000 in 7 months. We need about 1,500, 1,600 interviews per month for the region. And that's probably going to be something like a 4,000 to 5,000 increase in a typical month, right? And if it was a 5,000 increase for let's say 6 of the 7 months, that would get us 30,000 numbers more than we've got now. That takes us to 52,000. And then the 7th month, September, would just be the sort of the finishing off, right? Another 3,000 or 4,000 case numbers, maybe another 5,000 case numbers in that month. So look to increases each month of roughly averaging out at about 4,000 or 5,000 per month in Africa. That's all they need to do. Okay, they don't need to do very much more than that. They will also potentially, we might see those numbers go slightly faster. So you might see only small increases of 3,000 to 4,000 for the next couple of months, and then slightly larger increases of 4,000 to 5,000 or 5,000 to 6,000 in later months. That's partly because the number of the density reduces in later case numbers, right? So we will run into a little bit of that factor, and so we might see that. But so whether we get 3,000 increase or 4,000 increase or 5,000 increase, frankly, is not very exciting. So the idea of trying to predict what next month's visa bulletin is with relatively low numbers, when we realize that we're not going to go to 86,000. When you make that connection and you understand the reality of the situation, then you will stop looking for huge jumps in any 1 month, right? It probably won't happen. And I know we're going to have some YouTubers. There's one YouTuber in particular that each year talks about, we'll have to have a big jump at some point. We have to have a big jump. Well, no, we don't have to have a big jump. They can organize things properly. And telling people constantly, as that guy was telling people last year for 3 or 4 months before it finally happened, every month he was saying next month will be a big jump. It'll be a big jump next month. Complete waste of time and complete guesswork. There's really no need to do that. So like I said, I don't really want to get involved on a month-to-month basis trying to predict the visa bulletin for next month. It's kind of a silly game, but common sense will tell you we've got 30,000 numbers to move in 7 months, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe 35,000 in 7 months, but that's about it, right? And so you can figure out what's going to happen from there fairly easily. All right, everybody. Now, last thing, if you could make sure you're subscribed to my channel. If you've come across my channel and you've not subscribed before, I suggest you do that for me now, and for yourself, frankly, to get the right information. I'd also appreciate if you can give me a thumbs up, like on this video. It helps get my video known out there. And make sure all your friends come and listen to me as well. I'm quite funny sometimes, right? I would like to get more followers to get my message out there and make sure people are getting accurate information. And by the way, I don't charge any money for anything I do. I don't charge for silly guiding programs, guidance programs, or guiding me in, or whatever bullshit names people want to come up with. I don't charge money for those things. I don't think that's the right thing to do. This is a free process. There are many people who are on limited budgets. I well understand that the costs involved in going through this process are already high enough without people like me, YouTubers, trying to also take money from you. That's just not necessary. I'm giving you this information for free, and frankly, my information is at least as good as anybody else's information. Let me put it that way. All right, everybody, have a great night. Thank you. Bye-bye.